Nearly 30 years ago, Ted Koppel dedicated 3 segments of Nightline to a series of interviews with a then little-known retired Brandeis University sociology professor named Morrie Schwartz, who was then suffering from ALS. At one level, it might seem like an odd editorial choice. Nightline at the time was perhaps the most important show in American news, and using so much of its limited airtime was an unusual decision. But what Koppel and his producer, Richard Harris, knew was they could have it with Morrie, more than just a TV segment, but an extraordinary rumination about death, life, and what it means to age well. Even as ALS robbed him of his ability to function, Morrie taught us about embracing life and being the best person you can be. Everyone knows they're going to die, but no one believes it. If we did, we would do things differently. The truth is, he told Koppel, once you learn how to die, you learn how to live. Perhaps you know the next chapter. Mitch Albom, a sports reporter for the Detroit Free Press and a former student of Morrie's, saw the Nightline segments, reconnected with his old professor, and began a string of visits and conversations with Morrie that eventually become the much beloved memoirs, Tuesday with Morrie, a book which spent 4 years on the New York Times bestseller list, 23 straight weeks at the top. Morrie missed all of this since he had passed away from ALS, but it was in another way that he ensured that he lived on through his ideas, loves, and relationships. You might think that would be the end of it, but it's not. In the early 2000s, well after Morrie had passed away, his son Rob rediscovered an unpublished manuscript, Morrie's last book, which turned out to be his final thoughts and ideas about aging well. Rob, himself a professional writer and editor, took on the role not only of son, but editor, and his efforts have produced this delightful new book, The Wisdom of Morrie, Living and Aging Creatively and Joyfully. Rob is with us today to talk about the new book. Thank you, Rob Schwartz, for being with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, Martha and I have tons of questions for you, Rob, but I also want to remind the audience that we want your questions too. So beginning right now, producer Kate has opened up the Q&A, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. So Rob, let's thank you for being here. You rediscovered this manuscript in the early 2000s, and then your family had to make a decision about what to do with it. So tell us about that discovery and why you decided to work on it.
Sure. Well, I'll take a few steps back first, because sometimes when people tell that story, they thought that I had never seen this manuscript before, or I knew nothing about it, and that's not actually the case. I was very lucky because when I was in my early 20s, I did a big trip around Asia, a big, adventure, so to speak. And then I moved back home for 3 months in 1989. And that's exactly when my father was working on this book. So I lived in the house and I met with my dad, obviously every day. We were living in the same house, and I talked with him about his ideas for this book and what he was thinking and what he was writing. So I really had a firsthand knowledge of him writing this book and his ideas about this book. But then, as you say, he finished the book and he put it in his desk drawer, and he got ill, and the manuscript stayed there for more than 10 years, something around that amount of time. And then one day I was at his desk in his study, which my mother had left exactly as it was. And I opened the desk drawer and I found the book. So all of the thoughts and memories of him writing the book came rushing back, in addition to, as you state, the ideas of what should we do with it and how are we going to handle this and those kind of thoughts. So it was a huge discovery and a big moment in my life that I had a chance to do something with my father's writing. Yeah.
So was that the first time you had read the manuscript? You had not seen it at all while your dad was writing it?
That's more or less correct.
What went through your mind?
Yeah.
I was going to say, what went through your mind as you read it?
Well, it's a big manuscript, and actually, to tell you the truth, one of my major jobs was cutting it down a little bit. So there was a lot of editing involved, but certainly I can hear my father's voice ringing throughout the entire manuscript. And I think anybody who's familiar with the Ted Koppel interviews or even Tuesdays with Morrie will hear the same voice. It's really very strong in this book. So of course I could hear my father talking this book, and it's written in that way as well. Not exactly talky, but very familial. There's a lot of stories, a lot of poetry, a lot of creative things are added to it. It's not just like a book that, has a narrative that you read from front to back. It has a lot of unique parts to it. So yeah, it was very exciting for me to read it, but also really brought my father alive for me.
So you said you had to do a lot of cutting. It was a very big manuscript. What was the most challenging part about editing? How did you decide what part of your father's words were you going to?
Right, right. Well, certainly the most important task, and this was supported by my mother, who actually had edited a lot of my father's academic work. Most of the writing that my father had done before this, not all of it, but most of it had been academic in going back to the 50s and 60s. And my mother had edited most of that work. So she had a lot of tips for me. And the number one thing, and this is pretty obvious, is that I wanted to maintain my father's voice, right? He has such a distinct voice. And as an editor, if I screwed that up, it would be a major disaster. So I had to maintain his voice throughout. Then after that, I mean, what to cut was reasonably clear. My father liked to make lists. So if you make a list of 5 things, great. You make a list of 20 things, that's a little too long. That needs to be cut, you know. And wrote the book over a long period of time. In my introduction, I let people know he wrote the book from 1988 to 1992. So that's 4 years. So there was repetition. I don't think that he read back over his chapters to see exactly what he had already said. There was repetition in later chapters, and there was stuff that needed to be cleaned up. So there was a lot of editing that needed to be done, but I hope that I was faithful to his main ideas and his voice, as I said.
Was there anything in there, Rob, that surprised you, that was different than how you remember talking to your father about the book?
Let me think. Anything that was surprising? There was a lot of things that were very touching, some of which I had heard about before, and some of which maybe were a little bit new. I mean, maybe it was new for me to see in writing. I guess a couple of the things that was a little bit surprising, though maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, because as I said, I talked to him about the book while he was writing it, is there's more than one mention of me in the book, which I was surprised about, because, you know, this is a book about aging and being creative and joyous while you age, and, you know, for all people at all times. But my father puts a lot of himself in there, his own fears, his worries, and things like that. And also trips. My father actually came to visit me in Japan. Both parents did, not just my father. My parents came to visit me in Japan, and he puts that in the book, which I was surprised about. I mean, just a little paragraph, not chapters and chapters, because it's not the main point, obviously. But he's using that as an example of having new experiences, how new experiences will open your mind to different things. And that's a major point in the book. So it makes sense that he wrote about Japan. But that was one of the things that was a little bit surprising. One thing that was expanded upon, though I can't say this was surprising because I knew about it, but it's a real callback to Tuesdays with Morrie. So one of the huge things in my father's life, and for the people who have read Tuesdays with Morrie, they'll probably remember this, is that he lost his mother at a very young age. He lost his mother when he was 8 years old. And he talks to Mitch about it a little bit in Tuesdays with Morrie, but in this book, he goes into a long description of how long it took him to grieve for her and possibly heal that wound. And he talks about experience that he had in his 50s. So, you know, 45 or more years since his mother passed away. And I had heard this before, but, you know, it's pretty powerful to read it just written down in you know, narrative format.
So you mentioned that you had an older brother. What was his reaction to you picking up the manuscript, editing it, and looking to publish it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the whole family has been very, very supportive. My brother is, as I mentioned to you earlier, a computer software engineer. So he doesn't really have anything to do with editing or publishing or that whole world, but he's been very, very supportive. And my mother was also extremely supportive, as I mentioned, and helped me with the book. But yeah, the whole family was very supportive in writing the book. Obviously, it was my project. I took it on. I was the one that pushed it forward and said, you know, we have to get this out there. But yeah, the family was extremely supportive.
What kind of reactions have you gotten since the book came out from people who probably feel like they know your father from
Right,
Tuesday
right,
Morrie?
right.
I mean, it's one of those things people probably don't know him, but they feel like they know him.
Yeah, well, I could talk about that for a long time. And just as a side note, I have talked about that quite a bit because before I published this book, and this sort of prepared me to publish it, as you guys probably know, there's a film, there's also a play,
Yeah.
Tuesdays with Morrie. And the play is extremely popular in this country and also all around the world. So I've done Q&A after the play in this country, but also in China, in Taiwan, in Japan. Yeah, especially in China. It's crazy how popular the play is in China. I can talk to you about that for a long time if you're interested. But the point is that so I'm used to answering questions about my father, and the difference between the way people view him and who he really was is interesting. I mean, maybe it's not as, divergent as some other cases, but of course there is a separation there, as you said. But of course, the reaction, to answer your question, the reaction to this book has been fantastic. People have been very excited to read more from my father. And I really feel that this book does fit very well with Tuesdays with Morrie. I mean, if this book was completely different than Tuesdays with Morrie, I would still want to get it out there, but that's not the case. I mean, you can easily see the continuity between Tuesdays with Morrie and this book. Tuesdays with Morrie is a slim volume, but my father's ideas are in there. This is just an expansion of pretty much the same ideas. I mean, there's some new ideas, some ideas he didn't mention in Tuesdays with Morrie, but it's just a much deeper dive. It's a much thicker book. It's my father discussing his ideas at much greater length. And it's ironic because this book feels like a follow-up to Tuesdays with Morrie, but in fact, chronologically, this book was written before Tuesdays with Morrie, and it would have to be written before Tuesdays with Morrie because, as your audience may or may not remember, my father never saw Tuesdays with Morrie. He passed away before Mitch had written one word of that book. So,
can I just say, Martha, I just want to ask a follow-up because a lot of what Rob said was interesting. I'm just curious, it's a little bit of a divergence, but what the heck? I'm curious about, since you've had conversation with people in China and Japan and the US, whether there's different perceptions of how we age and therefore different perceptions of the book, of different responses that you get from different people in different cultures.
I mean, I think there is. It's hard to, encapsulate a whole culture's, attitude to aging, but my father actually mentions it in the book, and he even specifically mentions China, which is kind of fascinating given the popularity of the play in China. And I mean, it's really stunning. The play has been performed over 250 times in China at the biggest, most prestigious theaters in Beijing and Shanghai. The two actors who have portrayed Mitch and my dad are actually Taiwanese, but they have a huge following in mainland China. So it's just been a huge event. And I mean, I personally did Q&A after 6 different performances. So it's really, really popular. I think that, and this is of course a generalization, but I think it's true, and my father mentions it in the book. I think that both of those societies, Japan and China, have much more of a reverence for elderly people than we do in our society. And there's a big tradition of that in China. Without going too deep into Chinese philosophy and Chinese history, I mean, the foundation of Chinese culture is Confucianism, and Confucianism, one of the major tenets of Confucianism is respecting your parents. That is a big thing in Confucianism. So I think that there is more reverence of elderly people, but it's really ironic because Japan now, where I lived for a long time, some of your viewers may know, some they may not know, I lived in Japan for a long time, is kind of in crisis right now because they have such an aging society that they're unsure whether the working population is going to be able to support the aging population, the population who are no longer working. And there's been a lot of, public discussion of this and even some policy. And right now there's a movie out called Plan 75, which is kind of what would you call it, like dystopian, where Plan 75 is that they're putting elderly people to death at age 75. It's nobody is suggesting this in Japan. It's a dystopian movie, but that's the kind of atmosphere that exists in Japan now, despite the fact that their culture has traditionally had a reverence for elderly people. And so, I mean, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, I will point out that the American analog to Plan 75 was Logan's Run, if you remember
Logan's
that.
Run, yeah.
Sure,
They
that's
put people to
70s.
death, I think at 31. So that's a
Yeah.
little bit of a cultural difference between how we perceive
That's
aging
you're
in
over the
country.
hill in this culture at
Right.
31.
Exactly.
So, Rob, I want to go back to something you said about kind of, as you've talked to people about your dad and the divergence, there's sense that they know him, but there's a divergence between how they know him and how he was. What are some of the big differences?
Yeah, I mean, it is hard to discuss because in some ways the public persona is very close to who he was, but obviously Mitch is incredibly, complimentary, and nobody is an angel. So of course, on occasion he could get annoyed, or he could get angry, or he could get frustrated. It's not like he was even keel all of the time. All of us have those moods. I think that maybe some of the things that don't come through in Mitch's book maybe come through a little bit more in this one, maybe not, is that he had this sort of childlike quality to him that I'm not sure it comes through in Tuesdays with Morrie. I feel like in Tuesdays with Morrie, he comes through as this sage, elderly man teaching about life, but he had this aspect to him that was so childlike, and the world was so wondrous, and really like, this energy of a child. In the English language, we have two words. We have childish and childlike. And we all know childish is a bad thing. It's immature and impatient, but childlike is a wonderful thing, right? It has this sense of wonder and beauty of the world and how amazing everything is. And he really had that very, very strongly. And anybody who knew him will tell you that. So I think that's one difference between maybe the public persona and the actual person. I mean, then again, as I said earlier, he was a real person. So of course he had moods, and, he got frustrated, and it was, nobody is a saint. And people often ask me, like, what were you frustrated with growing up? And, of course I have stories that any child would have about their father, but in retrospect, they're pretty minimal, I think.
So has working on this project changed your understanding of Morrie's philosophy of life?
That's a deep question. I'm not sure that it had changed my understanding. It certainly sharpened it and deepened it. I mean, these were things that we talked about, some of the things we talked about a lot, or even I noticed. So maybe I should give a little information about the book so I can answer your question a little bit better. I would say this book really works on two different levels. On one level, since my father's training is a social psychologist, my father is talking about the sort of damaging idea that elderly people are just don't have anything left to live for, or, or worthless. It's basically ageist idea. And this is a psychological idea and attitude which really damages people. And he discusses this in the first few chapters of the book. And he says that, people have this idea, and indeed we internalize this idea. And that's why elderly people feel like they can't do anything, because they've internalized this ageist idea. And he really writes very strongly how this is a poisonous idea. You need to get rid of it, understand that it's been put upon you and get rid of it. He even creates a new term. This one isn't quite as psychological, but he calls it age casting, in the same vein as the word typecasting for actors, where it's like elderly people are pushed into certain roles and kept in those roles. Like, you're an old person, you're just supposed to go to the coffee shop and sit there all day, or, whatever elderly people are supposed to do. And he's saying you need to break out of that age cast and do whatever you want to. If you want to work, if you want to start a new project, you want to have a new interest, that's exactly what you should do. And so the first part of the book is about the psychological damaging attitudes that our society have and that people internalize. And then there's the rest of the book is about things that you can actually do. There's practical tips and things that you can actually do to try and live more joyously and more creatively. So I think actually on both of those fronts, to answer your question, it really sharpened my understanding of my dad's philosophy. I didn't realize that he thought that much about aging before this book. I mean, of
Mm.
course, as I told you, I talked to him while he was writing about it, so I knew that. But as I said earlier, my father had this childlike quality of wonder at the world, and it almost made him feel like ageless. In fact, one of my cousins at a memorial service at the house that we had for my father, a very like insightful cousin who is an artist and a poet, said exactly that. He said that Morrie always seemed ageless to me. As soon as he said it, I was like, wow, that's exactly correct. So this idea that he was thinking about aging came in this period of his life, and he had never thought of himself as an elderly person, despite the fact that he started writing this book when he was over 70, right? But that's exactly what he starts, the point that he starts at. Like, I never thought of myself as an elderly person, but society views me that way.
Right.
And then he started to examine those attitudes that society was putting out there. And that's the point about how poisonous ageism is. So in that sense, I started to think about those philosophies of his, which I hadn't really thought of so much. The rest of the stuff about actual tips that we can do, I think these are very much present in, for example, Tuesdays with Morrie, maybe not in as much depth, but very much present, where he talks about ways to get involved with society, ways to develop yourself. And not only did I hear him talk about these things, I saw one of the things that he talks about in the book that I saw him do every week for many, many years is meditation. I mean, he did it more than every week, but a meditation teacher came to the house every week. So I observed it. And he talks a lot about meditation in the book. And it's not just like, oh, meditate. As anybody who's tried to do it knows, it's not nearly that easy. You know, you have to really apply yourself. And my father describes ways that you can try and approach it if it's difficult for you.
So I want to remind people before I ask Rob the next question, that if you have questions for Rob, feel free to put them in the Q&A or chat. And Producer Kate will review them for us. We'll try to get to as many as possible.
Right.
So Rob, we're talking about, do you conceive of this book sort of as a self-help book in its orientation? And what are some of the key, I don't want you to spoil the ending for the audience, they need to go out and buy it, but what are some of the key ideas that your father had about how to age well?
Okay, sure. I mean, how to age well is one way to put it. I think that he would put it like the subtitle of the book, How to Remain Joyous and Creative While You Age, I think is the way that he would look at it. So yeah, I can enumerate them. I mean, off the top of my head, there's about 5 different things, 5 different tips or ideas that he puts out there. Some of them are quite, you know, okay, a lot of people might think that, and some of them are quite surprising. One of the things that my father talks a lot about in the book, or at least he has a section on, which I've not really seen too many people talk about, is laughter. He's really sort of a little dispirited about how it seems like elderly people sort of forget to laugh and enjoy things. So he says, whatever, you know, you find humorous, whatever you find comedic, go after that, develop that, pursue it, and laugh as much as you can. Laughter is so important in our lives. So that's one of the things. And, you know, he writes a lot about it so people can learn more in the book. Some of the other things are, he writes a lot about meditation, as I said. He suggests that you maintain and strengthen and create new human connections, right?
Mhm.
That's the sort of one of the main themes that, of course, comes through in Tuesdays with Morrie. My father was all about his relationships with other people. That's sort of the central tenet of his philosophy, let's say, is you guys will remember this from Tuesdays with Morrie. You know, at the end of your life, the size of your bank account isn't going to matter. But the time that you shared with your loved ones and your friends and those things, that's what's going to matter to you. So he's saying, don't wait till the end of your life till you're on your deathbed. You know, make your connections with your friends and your family stronger, share more things with them, you know, share more love with them, and also create new relationships. Another thing that he's sort of dispirited about is that old people seem to cut themselves off from society. He's saying, you have time, you have financial stability, do the opposite. try and make more connections with people, more engagement with society. And he offers tips on how to do that. He's saying, if you create a new interest, find something you're interested in and explore it. Not only will you learn new things and be interested, but you'll connect with other people who are interested in the same thing as you. That's one of the major ways that people connect, over shared interests, right? So he's saying this is something that's crucial for elderly people, to create new interests and explore them, go to clubs, read about them, find people. Now we have like online, right? So you can connect with anybody about anything online. So that's another major technique that my father offers to make your life, more fulfilling, more joyous, more creative.
So I have a question from the audience that I think is terrific, given the fact that you described your dad as sort of enthusiastic and, sort of embracing life, childlike. Did he ever discuss, his own fears and personal negative thoughts?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a great question. And I think that the questioner has pointed out something that I rarely talk about when I'm talking about this book, but it is a big part of the book. So my father just doesn't talk about, peaches and cream and flowers and sunshine. He absolutely talks about negative thoughts and fears and despair. He has a whole chapter on despair and the way that he deals with it. And, each individual person will have to see if this helps them, because despair is a difficult thing for everybody, is that my father looks at it philosophically. There's always a continuum. He calls it a tension of opposites between despair and hope. And, where you are on that continuum at any given time is where you are. And you need to accept that, embrace it. And, if you're feeling terrible, okay, you can try and make yourself feel better, but you have to understand you won't always feel wonderful. That's just not the nature of the human experience, right? Our experience is a continuum with two opposites, let's say despair and hope, or, lots of other things where we can look at them as opposites. And it's always a continuum, and you're always going to be somewhere on that continuum. So my father discusses that quite a bit. And the whole idea of tension of opposites and the continuum of experience that we have as human beings is a huge theme in this book, and discussed in many different chapters in many different ways. But there is particularly one to answer the questioner's question on despair. He has a whole chapter on despair, or let's say a whole section on despair and what to do and how to deal with it and how to approach it philosophically. Of course, he was a very philosophical person.
So in that vein, I'm curious, Rob, the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, is out today with another, it's not a new thought, about the loneliness crisis in the United States. So he had another op-ed in Times today or yesterday.
Yes.
And he's actually out with a loneliness plan. So I'm curious both how you respond as someone who's thinking deeply about these questions, and how you think your dad might respond to sort of not just the individual challenges people are facing, but the social challenges that we're
Absolutely. Facing. I mean, those are, I hope this doesn't sound too whatever self-serving, but that's exactly what my father addresses in the book, that elderly people cut themselves off from the rest of society, become very lonely and isolated. And he talks about what a terrible thing that is. So my father addresses that directly in the book. And as I alluded to earlier, he says that your connection with other people is the most important thing. It's literally the most important thing to keep you going, is your connection with other people, your relationships. So however you can strengthen those relationships and make more connections, you should go down that road. But he talks about it specifically, both how difficult it is and offers ideas for people to, increase their connections and strengthen their connections. So it's exactly what he's focused on. And I did see that news report. It came out today, this morning. So I thought it was pretty apropos. Absolutely. I wish I could give the Surgeon General a copy of this book.
So Rob, I'm curious, as you sort of went through the manuscript and edited it and sort of reflected on the lessons that your dad was sort of putting out there, has it impacted your life? I mean, have you changed how you think about the future and the way you're navigating it?
That's a pretty deep question. I'd have to probably think about that for a long time since it's such a personal question, but I will tell you one thing. Like my father, I'm a pretty emotional person. And that's, I think in some ways, that's a good thing. Obviously, if I didn't think it was good, I would try and change. But it does mean that you have emotional reactions to people. And on two levels, I've been trying to sort of think about how that might, end up in negative consequences. One way, it's just, you can get emotional when you're talking with somebody, maybe crosswords will be exchanged, or in a more severe case, you can have a fight with somebody and the relationship can be broken, and my father in this book and also in Tuesdays with Morrie encourages people to try and heal all of their relationships. And it's also something, he's talked about when you're on your deathbed, you'll regret the fact that you broke off a relationship with somebody over something ridiculous, something that you can't even remember. You can't even remember why the relationship with this person ended, but it ended negatively. It ended badly. And he says, make it your job, make an effort to go out and heal those relationships. So, if you need to apologize, put it in the past. Having a warm relationship and sharing time and sharing love with somebody is the most important thing. And some inconsequential fight that you had where both of you were upset is so meaningless. And you will see it that way in later life and certainly at the end of your life, right? And to answer your question, that has recently been impactful on me. I've thought about people whose relationships has been that I've had, broken off and maybe try and restart them, or other people who I felt, didn't treat me properly. And you have to work on forgiveness if you felt you weren't treated properly. But I think that's the goal, to realize that if somebody didn't treat you properly, yeah, maybe they have their own things going on. Maybe it was something in their life that led them to act that way. And you need to have compassion and forgiveness for them. I think that's what my father would say. And I think that's something that I've tried to learn, or, going down this road with editing this book.
Let me ask you a question, Rob, from the audience. But I'm going to expand it. So the question from the audience is, did your dad promote more focus by medical schools on gerontology as an internal medical practice? But I want to expand. Your dad was a teacher. Did he think schools, universities, the educational system was really preparing people to live longer, healthier lives, psychologically balanced lives?
Yeah, I mean, this also could be a really long answer on many different levels, because in one way, my father was a social psychologist and very professional in that area. In terms of medical schools, I don't think that he really approached medical schools. And in that way, you need to think about the chronology. As I said, my father never thought of himself as an elderly person until one day he realized society viewed him that way, and he started working on this book, and it really consumed him for 3-4 years, and then he got ill. So it wasn't like he had an opportunity to I've written this book, let me take it to medical professionals and see what they think, and let me take it to medical schools. He didn't really have that orientation, because he was working on the book, and then he got ill and he put the book in a drawer. On the other hand, conversely, he was quite critical in some ways of the psychological establishment and ways that they treated people and ways that they, attempted to offer treatment, both in a sort of, what would we say, maybe socioeconomic sense, and also in a psychological sense. And when I say a socioeconomic sense, my father became a therapist, back in the 70s. Wasn't nearly as widespread as it is today. I think people who are old enough will remember that. It was fewer people were taking therapy back then, and it was very expensive. So my father, with a group of other psychologists, started a mental health collective in Cambridge, Massachusetts, called Greenhouse, which offered therapy on a sliding scale, meaning you could pay what you could, basically. And if you had no money, they would offer you therapy for free. And this was pretty radical back in the day. So my father was pretty critical of the establishment in that way, that only people who could afford it could get treatment. In terms of treatment, he would be somewhat aghast at the way the psychological industry has gone today with the reliance on drugs, right? He was really, that was really not his thing. His thing was to work through the emotions, work through the psychological barriers. You need to do the work to heal yourself. It's like popping a pill. Maybe some psychologist believes that's going to make you okay. But my father thought that, that was just not really going to achieve the final result, So he definitely was critical of the establishment in a bunch of different ways. But I don't think that he ever thought about the establishment of medicine or gerontology per se.
So I'm going to riff off another question from the audience that I think is tied up in this. So clearly your dad's belief that relationships and social connections are ever critical in aging well, whether personal and sounds like his professional life the same. What do you think he would make of this world of Zoom that we're living in, and sort of the internet world where relationships don't look the same way they used to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question to answer because obviously he didn't experience that, and he wasn't very technically literate, as some people might guess. He was a real people person. He taught students in person for 35, 40 years at Brandeis University, and he didn't even know how to type. Everything was handwritten. Not this manuscript, fortunately. Fortunately, he had this manuscript typed up by a typist after he finished writing it, or more or less finished writing it. So I had a typed version of it. But sorry, what was the question?
What would
he make of Zoom? What would he make of Zoom? And yeah, it's hard to answer. I think that he probably would think that it's a nice stand-in for an actual relationship, but it's not the same thing as sitting in the same room with somebody, being able to touch their hand, actually look into their eyes, not look into a screen. I think that we've really become, inured to this, especially through the pandemic. This is just regular life for us now, but it's not the same thing. All of us know it's not the same thing as sitting in the same room with somebody. And I think, my father would have mixed feelings about it, to say the least.
I'm going to bring in a comment from the audience again. Was actually asking you a question about greenhouse as you were answering it. So bring it up. So don't need to ask the question, but I will say the person in the audience spent some time with your father in couples therapies as we were that she was dissolving her marriage. He was terrific. So you have someone in the audience who actually knew your dad and worked with your dad, which is I think a nice thing. So you talked about your dad. So one of the central messages is staying human. Can you sort of, what does that mean? Especially in sort of this, really divisive age we're in, when humans are seeming to be at each other's throats a lot.
Right. Well, I mean, it means a lot. It means a lot of different things, but certainly in the context of what you just said, it certainly means trying to remember that each person sort of has their own individual challenges, their own individual worlds, and try to look at everybody with compassion and the world from their perspective, which is very hard for us to do. We always say that, oh, look at it from the other person's point of view, but it's actually very hard to do because we can only approximate their point of view. We don't really know somebody else's point of view, right? So we can only kind of think about their world and think, oh, maybe they see the world this way, or maybe they see the world that way. But I think that that is something that my father would really focus on in terms of stay human. It's compassion and adopting different points of view, which he talks about in this book. And fundamentally, this is fairly abstract, but fundamentally, stay human is about understanding that we all have a shared human experience, right? Somebody seems very different from you, or their values are very different, but you need to understand that those values come from a human experience which is actually the same as yours. So whether, their values are super different, you should realize it comes from a place of caring about their loved ones, caring about their family, being, devoted to certain values. And that's a very human experience, right? And in that way, my father hopes that people can identify as human, not as Black or white or Christian or Muslim or anything else, but as human. Our fundamental identity is as humans. And I think that that is what he means by stay human.
I'm going to paraphrase a question from the audience. You talk about the continuum, the balance of hope and despair, and the importance of reaching out to expand your base to ward off loneliness.
Yeah.
Did your dad ever talk about going too far on the reach out spectrum to the point that it turns negative or counterproductive? Like, can you go too far?
I mean, again, that's sort of a deep question I'd have to think about for a long time. I mean, I think that possibly what he might say about this, and there are people that we can notice who are like this, is that, it's possible for you to give too much of yourself away, right? You can always be trying to care and take care of others. I mean, I think this is a problem that a lot of young mothers have, right? They're completely focused on their child all of the time, and they forget their own needs. So I'm certain that my father would say, if you have needs, make sure you attend to them. Don't always be focused on other people's needs. It's great to focus on other people's needs. It's very compassionate to do so. But if you have needs that yourself, make sure that those are met as well. So I think that might be the way that people would go too far. And I also think this relates to the earlier thing that I mentioned, which you also alluded to, that, it's a tension between those two different things. And it's always a continuum. You need to remember that. There's no way that you're always going to be way over here being the most compassionate person alive. No, not even the Dalai Lama is like that, right? And if you're way over here, totally selfish, always about yourself, then, that's going to be a hard way to live and people aren't going to be able to connect with you. So it's a continuum. And I think another thing that's in the book and relates to this discussion is don't judge yourself too harshly. Try and be compassionate, try and do these things. And here are some suggestions for you. But if it doesn't work, don't judge yourself too harshly. Because I think my father saw that was one of the things that really drove people down, is self-judgment. Is having a really bad self-image because I didn't do this good enough and I didn't do that good enough. And you need to avoid that trap, Doesn't mean you don't strive to be a better person, but if you're constantly judging yourself in a negative way, yeah, you're going to be unhappy. And really one of the bases of this book is that my father's trying to remove the stumbling blocks that keep elderly people and indeed all people from being happy. That's really the basis of it.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So here we are, Rob, 25 years after your father's death, still talking about him, referring to him as Morrie, as by one name, Cher, Madonna, Morrie. What would he made of this? I mean, and I think people feel like they know him through various writings about him or by him. What would he have made of this celebrity? Would he have enjoyed this? Would it have been off-putting?
I love this question. I love this question because I get it a lot. And I think people are surprised by the answer. He would have adored it. He would have loved it. He seems like this cute, shy man. He had this side of himself, which was like a performer. He was a college professor for 40 years. He stood up before students and talked and lectured and stuff. He loved the spotlight in parties. He loved to tell jokes. He loved to dance. He would have been overjoyed at this attention that people are actually taking his ideas and trying to use them. I mean, one, because obviously he believed very deeply in these ideas, but two, it was a real part of his personality to enjoy the spotlight. So once again, as I've alluded to before, it's very ironic that he never got to enjoy this, despite the fact that he's influencing and, touching so many people today. But that's the way life goes, that's what happened. And it's certainly a wonderful thing that people are able to read his words and touched by, what he has to say at this point in time.
So great question in the chat. So how about you, Rob? Are you enjoying the spotlight of talking about his book in so many venues?
I think it's probably obvious to all of you watching. I love talking about my father, which is one of the reasons as I said earlier, before I even wrote this book, I decided myself, oh, Tuesdays with Morrie, the play is performed all over the world and all over the country. I have reached out specifically myself without any PR agents or anybody acting on my behalf to little productions in Maine, in Ohio. I recently did one in Tuscarawas County, Ohio. Shout out to Roxy and Megan. Wonderful production of Tuesdays with Morrie. I flew myself there. I, went to their play and did Q&A because I love talking about my dad.
Mhm.
And I think his ideas are important. I think the example that he gave to me and to the rest of the world is a great example to follow. I think he lived his life in a wonderful way. So yeah, as you can tell, I love talking about him. And, he's been gone for a very long time now. So this keeps him alive for
Mhm.
me. And
Yeah.
if I could, we can go back to one of the questions that I saw in the chat, because, he passed away a very long time ago, and this book was written a very long time ago, and I discovered it quite a long time ago. But, it took me a long time to properly grieve for my father and work through all of the sadness so I can talk about him with you like this and not feel, and, even sometimes, of course, I feel sad, that's natural, but I worked through a lot of grief. And I worked through a lot of grief after I discovered this manuscript, because as I said, it's sort of, his voice rings in my ears. So he's really alive for me. And I mean, I won't go too much into myself, but there was a lot of years where it was very difficult for me.
Mhm.
And, in some ways, his death was really sudden. Of course, he was sick for 16 months, and I can give everybody the chronology if they like, but he was very healthy before that. He had some asthma, and once that got under control, he was very healthy before that. We expected him to live for a very long time. And, he got this disease, he was gone pretty quickly.
Mm. Another question, you've done such a great job of sort of painting the picture of your dad as a professional, as a professor. What were some of his creative pursuits?
So I think that most of them I've touched on before. It's like he was not, an artist in the way that a lot of people are artists. He didn't paint, he didn't draw, he wasn't a musician. He loved music. He loved all of these things. He loved art, he loved music particularly, and I could go into that, but he wasn't a musician himself. He couldn't play any instrument. But I feel that, like, if you like, his art was really the way that he lived his life and relating with people. I mean, he had friends all across the age spectrum. In later life, he had friends from, different age groups, from students, different backgrounds, and particularly later in life, lots of friends, like differently abled people, so he really was able to connect with people across a range of any range that you'd like to put out there. He was able to connect with people, and that was sort of his art, was connecting with people and relating with them.
So I want to remind the audience, we're actually getting close to the end of our session with Rob, talking about the wisdom of Morrie. So we may have time for one, maybe two more questions from the audience if people have final questions. But Rob, let me ask you, what's next for you? Put a lot of time and a lot of yourself, obviously, into this book.
I'm glad that you asked that, because I have 2 or 3 things that I'm doing, one of which very much relates to this book. So I'd like to put it out there for people, though it's not exactly the same thing. So obviously, I'm promoting this book, and I'll say very briefly, though I haven't decided. I've been considering for a long time whether I should write a book on my father. And this would not be a biography. This would be stories about him and his life and his friends, so people could really get a deeper feeling of how he lived his life every day. So I'm considering that. I've done a lot of interviews with his colleagues and his friends, stuff, many of whom are gone now. So some of these interviews date back 20 years. But so I'm considering doing that. But right now I have 2 other big projects. And the one that heavily relates to this book is I'm involved with a foundation, and we're putting on a musical, a concert, a festival, a benefit festival. It's called One Topia, One Topia, Onetopia, and it's going to be 100% benefit for mental health. All of the money is going to go to mental health organizations throughout the country. And I feel, and the people who started the foundations, I'm not one of the founders of the foundations, I'm just a producer working with them, but we all feel that there's kind of a mental health crisis in this country, whether the pandemic, made it worse and all of that, but there's kind of a mental health crisis, and we need to focus more on that. So we're going to have a big benefit concert next year in 2024. The date isn't exactly set. The location isn't set either, but we're probably going to be held in LA. And you can go to onetopia.com to learn about that and hopefully participate in it. So that's one of the big projects that I'm working on. We didn't really talk about my background, so your viewers may not know. I mean, I've produced films. I worked at a TV station in Japan as a journalist, one of the Asia correspondents for Billboard magazine. So I write a lot about music. So my basic fields are music and film. So that's one big project that we're working on, Onetopia at onetopia.com, 100% nonprofit. All of the money is going to go to benefit mental health and mental health groups. And of course, we have our own foundation. We'll do a lot of research to make sure the money is used effectively. Then I also have a project, which is, since music is one of my fields, about concert creation in the metaverse. So we have a concert creation platform. It's called Mosh Pit. You can see it at moshpit.live. And we have great technology. We have fantastic coders who have created this incredible environment. I really think it's leaps and bounds above other metaverse concert platforms, but there's a lot of them out there. So we're playing in a big field there. This is a small startup that I'm a part of, but we really love what we're doing. And I think our visuals are actually better. But when you're fighting against multi-billion-dollar corporations, it's hard to get a foothold. That's moshpit.live, moshpit.live. You can go and look. We have concerts and songs up there. So, and I think we're going to launch that probably pretty soon. I think that the whole site will launch in June, but we already have stuff up. So those are two big projects that I'm involved in now. And, as a writer, as I said, I'm considering writing a book on my father, and I've had notes on a novel for a long time. I have to decide whether I'm really going to grind that one out or not. As I'm sure you guys know, it's really hard to write like that. Kudos to Mitch. He's an incredible writer. Mitch is unbelievable. He's got 10 bestsellers now.
So thank you for that, Rob. Kate has been busy. She's put up the link to both Onetopia and to Mosh Pit. So everyone can find it.
Thank you.
All right. Martha, do you have a last question? I think we're about at time, and I want to make sure we get a final question if you have one, Martha.
No, I just thank you, Rob. I enjoyed Tuesdays with Morrie, and I really enjoyed the Wisdom of Morrie, and would welcome the chance, given the conversation today, to learn even more about your dad. So go write that book.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really considering it now. I mean, the response to this book has been fantastic, and I'm really trying to do everything I can to get the book out there. So I would ask, obviously, I hope that people enjoy the book and they find it useful. I would ask, if you get a copy of the book, please write a review on Amazon, because it really helps. And it also, lets me know what people are thinking about the book, what the ideas are on Amazon or Goodreads, wherever you like to write a review. Please write a review of it.
Great. Thank you, Rob. So again, for everyone, I think everyone knows it now, but just in case, the book again is The Wisdom of Morrie, Living and Aging Creatively and Joyfully.
And let me say one quick thing. Sorry. I have a website, wisdomofmorrie.com, wisdomofmorrie.com. And it has a, reach out to us. So if anybody wants to get in touch with me, just write a note on there, put your email in there, and I will email you back. Particularly, I saw people in this chat who knew my father. And I would love to hear from people who knew my father, who went to Greenhouse in Cambridge, who used that therapy. So if anybody has any feedback or would like to get in touch with me, please, I absolutely encourage it.
Great. Thank you, Rob. And thank you for this wonderful conversation. It's going to be hard to top this one, but we're going to try. And I want to tell people about some of the events coming up for us. We have 3 great authors already scheduled for the next few months. Next up will be Hal Hirschfield, the author of the forthcoming book, Your Future Self, How to Make Tomorrow Better Today. Hal's a professor at UCLA, one of the nation's leading behavioral scientists. And the book, which will be released next month, explores how we can improve our decision-making and get out of our own way. I'm a little bit desperate for this book, I'll confess. And I think it will be a wonderful conversation. We're announcing the date for this event shortly, but look forward to the first half of June. On July 13th, a conversation with Ryan Frederick, author of Right Place, Right Time, The Ultimate Guide to Choosing a Home for the Second Half of Life. And on September 6th, we welcome Dan Buettner to discuss his new book, The Blue Zone: Secret for Living Longer, Lessons from the Healthiest Place on Earth. You can sign up for both the Frederick and Buettner events now. Kate's already put the link in the chat, or you can always find out details about it at our book club, including the tape of this interview on our book club page on longevity at longevityproject-project.com. Thank you all. Thank you, Rob, again. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Kate. And thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.